As they said, my name is Kristen Springer, and it's a great pleasure and honor to be here. I want to thank the organizing committee for inviting me and everyone for being here. This is a really important topic, and as I'm understanding the politics of France, it's even more amazing that this is happening here. So thank you very much. I was asked to start out by talking about the state of art for gender and health research and where I think we should be moving in the future. So it's quite a challenge and an honor to present, but I'll look forward to hearing your comments and your thoughts afterwards. And as they also talked about, I'm going to be basing this talk in part on a special issue that I did in 2012 in Social Science and Medicine on gender and health. And that was also with Rebecca Jordan-Young, who will be talking. I don't see her here yet. Oh, there she is with Beck. So she was also part of this special issue, and we were really lucky to have an amazing group of well-established scholars, including Anne Fausto Sterling and Raewyn Connell, as well as new scholars. And so part of this talk is going to be based on that, as well as kind of my ideas and my vision of where I think we should be going in the future. And again, pardon my... Okay, so first of all, if we're going to talk about where we should be going in the future, we need to talk about where we are now. I'll also say that I have a script that the interpreters have, but I tend to talk off a bit. So if they wave, feel free to wave me down and tell me to slow down. Okay, so where we are, most of what, and this has already been talked about earlier, most of what's been done so far in gender and health is looking at kind of static, binary, and biologically focused approaches to sex, gender, and health. But more important is, where are we going? And in terms of where we're going to go, what I'm going to talk about today is applying state-of-the-art gender theory to gender and health research. So really thinking about the gender theoretical perspectives and how we can apply those to health research. I'm going to focus on what I'm going to talk about as gender as relational or structural, intersectionality, and biosocial approaches. And I hope that you'll see throughout that talk that one of the great things about those three approaches is that you really can see the mechanisms and the processes and the explanations in terms of how gender is related to health. And so hopefully that will become clear throughout the talk, that one of the great advantages, in my opinion, of applying contemporary gender theory to health is that you get a sense of the processes of what's going on. You'll also see that I'm going to bring in quantitative examples and think about methodology. And I'm going to do quantitative examples for a key reason. One of the main concerns and problems that I've noticed in the literature with wanting to apply this rigorous feminist contemporary theory to health research is people are concerned that it can't be done with quantitative data, and that it's really hard to get that theoretical sophistication with quantitative data. And I would agree that it's more tangible and readily apparent how to do it with qualitative work, but I think it can be done with quantitative work, and I think it's important to show that we can do that, so that's not used as a stumbling block for us moving forward and applying this new feminist, not new, but it's new to health research pretty much, feminist theory to gender and health research. So I'm going to focus on quantitative research for that reason. Okay, so oops, two clickers, sorry. All right, so much of the research, as people have already alluded to, much of the research on sex and gender and health has been dominated by two foci. One are empirical examinations of trends and explanations for sex differences in disease and mortality, and two, sex-specific disease patterns, and correspondingly, often differential investments of research and policy attention to men's health and women's health needs. And so you see this quote here. More than 10,000 articles deal with sex and gender differences in clinical medicine, epidemiology, pathophysiology, clinical manifestations, outcome, and management. So this is what I'm talking about as what's kind of the common standard practice. And this is an example of one way you might see this manifested. So I'm sure all of you have seen a slide like this before. This is life expectancy. It happens to be Canada. I could put this up here for any country. The main part I want you to get across, which we've already alluded to as well, is that women outlive men, right? That there's a greater life expectancy for men for women, compared to men. And so this is some of the important work that we get out of this binary perspective. I'm going to complicate it, but I want to also say that we need this binary perspective to be able to understand at least some of these patterns. So one issue with the binary perspective is that these binary approaches often get linked directly back and squarely back to biological differences. So I use this quote up here as an example of this. So this is from Dan Fetterman, who is at the Harvard Medical School, and this is a review article, and it's in the New England Journal of Medicine. And some of you may know this, but if not, just to give you some context of the influence of this journal, There are more than 600,000 people in 177 countries read the New England Journal of Medicine each week. This is a very, very influential journal. So this is a review article, and let me read to you what he says. So everyone in medicine and related fields understands there are marked sex-based differences in the epidemiology, clinical manifestations, course, and therapy of disease. Although very few of these differences are understood in molecular or cellular terms, the explanation must derive, I've put this emphasis in here, from the fundamental biological differences between the sexes. Okay, so let's deconstruct that for a minute as we talked about. So what it's saying is that everyone in medicine and related fields knows this, we understand this, that there are these differences, and they must derive from the fundamental biological differences between the sexes. Okay, so there's that part. But then there's also, although a few of these differences are understood, right? So even though we know that they must derive from the biological differences, we don't know how they're done, and everybody knows this. So I point this out as an example of kind of this is, in some ways, the current state-of-the-art biomedical thinking of sex, gender, and health. And not where I think we should be moving from here. So what are some concerns or problems with this? So these binary effects are very important in that they've contributed to understanding the distribution and causes of disease and mortality, like the long life expectancy graph I showed you, and have led to dramatic improvements in the allocation of resources and in attention to previously neglected health issues affecting men and women. But they often do not reflect contemporary gender or feminist theory, and they inadvertently reinforce outdated binary constructions of sex, i.e. male or female, and gender, masculine or feminine, as we've talked about, as well as treat sex and gender as easily separable. Indeed, the existence of male-female differences in health outcomes is often considered self-evident and biologically based, and confirming these differences is often privileged over exploring similarities. Further, this perspective treats men and women as uniform groups. So again, these are some of the concerns with it. I do want to say a lot of us have done work like this, and this lays important groundwork, so I don't want to dismiss it for that, but I do want to say, in moving forward and where I think we should go in terms of our vision, I would suggest we're going to complicate that, and I'm going to talk about a variety of ways that I think we could do that. Okay, so I'm going to first start off by talking about the relational or structural perspectives to gender. Okay, so what do I mean by this? Some of this might be very, very familiar to some of you, and for others not so much. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about this because it's important for the foundation of the rest of the talk. So by relational instructional construction of gender, I mean the theory and research conceptualizing gender as a pervasive system of stratification that structures relationships and interactions between and among men and women. It shapes access to resources and status and the processes of reproducing or producing hierarchies. Gender is also conceived as an agential process, whereby the meaning and expressions of gender are negotiated and performed, both shaped by and reproducing the social. In other words, gender is not just constrained, but people have the power and agency in making and in shaping gender. So hallmarks of this approach are recognition of gender as dynamic and situational, attention to differences among men and among women, so not just looking across, and a dislodging of the assumed congruence between the binary categories of sex and gender. In other words, applying gender as relational structure means moving from rigid false binary categories and instead problematizing and understanding the construction of these categories. As such, understanding gender as structural and relational allows us to better explore the mechanisms and processes associated with gender and health, which is necessary if you want to think about interventions. You want to think about improving health, you need to understand the mechanisms, you need to understand the processes. And this relational approach helps us get at that. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example. Like I said, I'm going to be drawing on some quantitative examples. So what you see here is a map of the gender pay gap in the EU. And you'll see France here, gender pay gap is 14.8%. So again, what that means is that women for the same job or similar jobs earn 14% less than men do. So one way of looking at gender as relational or structural instead of looking at the binary of men and women is to look at things like the gender pay gap. Okay, so let's look at the gender pay gap as our way of thinking about gender and health outcomes. And the health outcome I used before was life expectancy, right? So one thing, this is a health economist who is doing this work, one thing this health economist has found is that the gender pay gap in life expectancy, that the gender gap in life expectancy closes when the gender pay gap closes, right? So that tells us something interesting in terms of gender and health. And the reasons behind this, according to this article, is that as women increase their labor market activity, they are spending less time investing in promoting their health. And men, therefore, because their partners are engaged more in the labor market, men feel less pressure to be the main earner, and so they are investing less. They're investing more in their health. So you see, as women are engaging more in the labor market because they're earning closer to what men earn, they are investing less in their health, and men are investing more in their health. So you see, by conceptualizing gender as a gender pay gap, you get a different sense and a different understanding of gender and life expectancy. So another important aspect of a relational perspective of gender is for exploring variation within men and within women, not just across. So in a recent paper by a great scholar, Tatiana Podrovska, she looked at how socioeconomic status, SES, at age 18 affects all-cause mortality in gendered ways for people born in the U.S. in 1930s and 1940s. And I can talk more about the data set if people want, but this is a primarily white data set. So what Tanya found, she found that early life SES disadvantage generates greater inequality and mortality among women decades later than among men. In other words, women were less able to overcome the low SES mortality link compared to men. This gender difference may reflect the fact that in this cohort, who was born in the 30s and 40s, women were expected to focus on familial obligations. Thus, low SES women had fewer opportunities for their own status attainment than low SES men. It was difficult for women to overcome this initial SES disadvantage and narrow the gap with their higher SES counterparts because of their limited mobility through educational and professional achievement. Thus, the negative health effects of early life SES was more pronounced among women because low SES women in this cohort had more social constraints than low SES men, which hindered their ability to break the chain of accumulation of disadvantages. So again, the point of this is to show that relational and structural perspectives of gender can give us a sense of the nuances. Okay. I'm talking too fast. Do you need me to back up? Okay. All right. So one of the benefits of using a relational and a structural perspective of gender is to get a sense of the nuances within gender categories as well, right? So here we're seeing how men and women, within men and women, how their life expectancy varies. Better? Sorry. Okay, so in terms of qualitative and gender as relational and structural, let's think about some important key points of this perspective. So one, you can use qualitative or quantitative methods. Like I said, I think these are in some ways more, this perspective is more easily done, more readily done with qualitative comparative historical methods, but it can, I hope I've shown you that it can be done with quantitative methods. There's an emphasis on process, mechanisms, and explanations. You can look at, explore nuances within groups of men and within groups of women, as well as across groups. And it also reminds us that gender is not in a person, right? We looked at gender as a gender pay gap, right? We looked at gender as SES variation based on familial roles and familial expectations for men and women who were born in the 30s and 40s. So this is a way of understanding gender as relational and as structural, not as in a person. Better? Okay. Okay, so now I'm going to move on. And again, this is kind of a quick overview because we could spend days and days and days talking about any one of these. I'm going to spend a decent amount of time talking about intersectionality as a way of complicating where we are with gender and health and moving forward. Okay, so intersectionality was inspired by post-colonial theory, black feminism, and queer theory. It's the idea that there's no monolithic group of women and no monolithic group of men, but rather experiences are based on positions within different structures of inequality, right? So for example, in the United States, black women's experience is qualitatively different than white women's experience. And so I'll read you a quote from Sojourner Truth, who, this is a famous quote in the United States. She says, that man, this was an emancipated slave, that man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best places everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? So Truth draws attention to the nonsense of talking about women as if there is a universal female experience, right? And perhaps more importantly, makes it clear that the concept of women itself is tied with race and class ideology. You can't just think about women as a group. So intersectionality challenges practices that privilege any specific access of inequality, such as race, class, or gender, and emphasizes the potential of varied and fluid configurations of social locations and interacting social processes in the production of inequalities. So this is kind of the basic foundational essence of intersectionality. I showed you this before, right? So this is the life expectancy chart. When we think about this from an intersectional perspective, what are we going to get when we think about intersectionality and life expectancy? And you can't see that. Okay, so what we see here, right, this is life expectancy. It's the US. We have, here we have age in years and years over time. And then we have white females, black females, white males, and black males. Right, so what do we notice? Life expectancy is not the same for all women and not the same for all men. We understand more about what's going on in terms of inequality and health if we break apart race and gender, if we look at race and gender simultaneously. A nice way of showing this is you can notice here that where white women were in the 1970s is where black women are today. Right, so that's terrifying and terrible from a health equality point of view, but it's really telling in terms of thinking about intersectionality and a way of understanding and thinking about gender and health together. And you may notice, though, you may be thinking, well, Kristen, you talked about how you're going to be complicating things, and you're back at this binary idea of gender, right? You're back at this binary male, female, black, white. That would be a good point if you said that. And so I think that basic binary is a really important place to start with intersectionality, but there's been some really amazing theoretical research complicating intersectionality and thinking about different ways of talking about intersectionality that fits more with gender, contemporary gender and queer theory, and that has not, for the most part, been applied well to health research, but I think has amazing potential. And I'm going to spend a decent amount of time talking about different ways of thinking about intersectionality as applied to gender and health research. And so we're going to talk about the group-centered model, the process-centered model, and the system-centered model, and then I'm going to end with just a little bit on methodology. Okay, so the group-centered model, and this I should say is primarily drawn from Chu and Ferry, at least the organization of it. It's in a sociological theory article. The concepts have been used elsewhere, and you can see some sites there, but the primary framing that I'm going to be talking about is based on Chu and Ferry. So the group-centered model is what we've talked about and what I've shown you in terms of looking at the different kind of black women, white women, black men, white men, life expectancy. So it's about inclusion. It's about thinking about placing multiply marginalized groups and their perspectives at the center of research. Right? So this is the foundational concept of intersectionality, is to bring people who are not necessarily at the center and who are not seen, bring them to the center. Right? So this is about groups and identities. The group model approaches these intersections like street corners, where race and gender meet and have multiplicative effects. So any street, if you think about streets such as social processes, so streets are sexism or racism, for example, they can be seen as crossing without transforming themselves. The next models I'll talk about, we'll see about how the processes are going to transform as well. So one risk with this is it risks fetishizing differences, right? So it risks saying like, well, this is what black men are like and this is what white men are like. It also ignores the process, right? It ignores the process of creating power, of creating difference. Okay, so the process-centered and the system-centered perspectives on intersectionality help deal with those. And it's also interesting to think about this from a social determinants of health perspective, that a central consideration of intersectionality is how multiple social identities at the individual level of experience are affected and are shaped by what's going on at the more macro level aspects of the world. And as you probably all know, this is also a very core tenet of population health, right? The social determinants of health that is focused on social structural factors beyond the individual, right? So as much as a lot of the idea of process-centered and system-centered intersectional perspectives have not been well applied to health yet, it fits really well with where health research has also been and is going. and this point is brought home by a recent article. So Boleg says, despite a plethora of research focused on multiply marginalized groups, public health studies that reflect intersectionality in their theoretical frameworks, design, analysis, or interpretations are rare. So he says or interpretations, and I think it's important to also say and is even more rare, right? So we have public health studies and health studies looking at multiply marginalized groups, but those actually thinking about theoretically, conceptually, analytically, interpretively, thinking about gender intersectionally, those are much rarer. And so I think this is a really great opportunity for future research. And I'm going to talk about this a bit more. Okay, so the process-centered approach focuses on the transformation of the substance of the processes, right? So focuses on the transformation of sexism or racism through their intersection. And so if you think about it, this is really where I talked about the group model is about the street corners. The process-centered model is about the intersecting streets, right? It's about the process of complicating the intersections. So the process model places primary attention on the context and comparison at the intersections as revealing structural processes organizing powers. So as such, highlighting dynamic forces such as gendering rather than gender. So one risk about this is losing sight of the people at the intersections, right? So we need to make sure when we're actually thinking about the processes, we don't forget that there are people who are situated at those intersections. And again, I think it's easier to think about this qualitatively, but I'm going to try to show you how we can do it quantitatively. Okay, so one example is some recent research by Grollman, and he wanted to explore the double disadvantage hypothesis. So this predicts that people adults in this case, who hold more than one disadvantaged status are going to experience worse health than singly disadvantaged people. And their privileged counterparts, right? So if you have multiple disadvantages, you're going to have worse health than you have only a single disadvantage or in a privileged position. But according to Grollman, this has produced conflicting results, in part because we don't look at discrimination. People don't look at the process, they looked at the identity. So what happens then if you look at the process, right? It happens if you take a process-centered approach to intersectionality. So what Grollman found is he used a U.S. national probability of sample, and he explicitly tested a process-centered model of intersectionality at health. So he looked at discrimination, also accounting for people's identities. So he found that people who had multiple forms of discrimination had worse health. So here he's looking at the process. He's looking at discrimination, not at their identities. So even accounting for their identities, the processes of discrimination and the multiplication of the processes of discrimination led to twice the risk of major depression and functional limitations and substantially lower self-rated health. So I hope you can see here that focusing on the processes, even using quantitative work, which is harder to get at process, even using these kind of mathematical models, you can get a better sense of what's going on in terms of the mechanisms if you're looking at a process-centered approach rather than just the group-centered approach. And of course, this would be great to follow up with qualitative work to really get a sense of what's going on. Okay, what about, I said there's this other approach, right, the system-centered. So finally, the system-centered approach sees intersectionality as shaping the entire social system. It helps push analysis away from associating specific inequalities with unique institutions. For example, associating the labor market for social class and families for gender. Instead, it looks at processes that are fully interactive, historically co-determining, and complex. Right? So the challenge is to identify local and historically specific configurations of inequalities. So this one is harder for me, at least for me, to get my head around, and not even to mention how to think about it quantitatively. It's harder for me. So just as a non-health example, I like to think about how labor and citizenship are institutions that are co-constructing class, race, family, and gender as systematic inequalities, right? And so this is like Evelyn Nakano-Glenn's work in 2002. So her work exemplifies this complexity by looking at historically specific intersections of labor and citizenship in the United States. what does that do for health? How do we think about that from a health perspective? Okay, so you all probably know this. Women have higher rates of depression than men. This has been done cross-nationally. We've seen this in many, 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 many countries. So one important thing to think about is how does a gender gap in depression vary by gender equity? Okay, if we think about gender equity as a system-centered variable, and we can think about gender equity as a system-centered variable in the sense that it's a macro-social characteristic of a society indicating that women have rights and opportunities in the public sphere. So it indicates women having a right to vote, obtain higher education, go out in public unchaperoned, earn income, and enjoy other rights that in some societies are reserved for men only. Right? So we can think about gender equity at the country level as this system-centered approach. So how might the gender gap in depression vary by gender equity? And again, here, think about it. We're thinking about gender and intersectionality at that system level. So using data from 23 countries, scholars have found, so Hopcroft and Bradley in this case, have found that the gender gap in depression is greater in high gender equity countries. Right? So women have more rights and more access to resources. There is a greater male-female gap in depression. Interesting. Why is that? Right? So from an intersectionality perspective, why would that be? That's a question we can think about from a system-centered intersectionality perspective. So there we go. So I'm going to talk about a little bit of work by Hopcroft and McLaughlin, who take a system-centered approach and look at the intersection of family systems, labor market, gender equity at the country level, and gender to get a sense of what might be going on here. And what they find is that children increase depression for women in high gender equity countries. So it's this normative pressure of intensive mothering, right? So in high gender equity countries, children increase the risk of depression. Whereas children decrease depression for women in low equity countries, especially for unemployed women, because children in low equity countries are a primary way of obtaining status for women. Kids don't matter, and employment doesn't matter either way for men's depression. So what we find then is the contrasting effect of children on feelings of depression for women in high and low gender equity countries can help explain why there is a greater gender gap in high equity countries. Specifically, gender equity appears to help male mental health, but not female mental health. This is the case because the majority of women have children, and therefore the negative effect of children on mental health for women in high gender equity societies counteracts the positive effects of gender equity. So you can see here, looking at a system-level intersectional approach, we can get a good sense of the nuances of gender and health. Okay, so I promised you I would give you a smidge of methodological considerations in terms of thinking about these complicated intersectional perspectives. So first and foremost is to ask intersectional questions. I mean, it sounds simple, but you need to come at it with thinking about and asking intersectional questions and think about what intersectional interpretations might be, right? So try to use an intersectional lens in thinking about your analyses. Qualitative and comparative historical data work very well. They're very rich for, especially comparative historical work is really, really excellent for this type of work. But as I've tried to show throughout the talk, quantitative analysis also work very well. And in doing so, comparative work works really beautifully because we can get a sense of how, for example, one system like the low gender equity countries versus the high gender equity countries, right? So comparing systems, comparative work works very well. Multi-level data works well if we think about, again, thinking about intersectionality as a system or as a process. We can look at data beyond the individual. We can look at how the individual is situated in specific sorts of environments. And again, we want to look at all the data situated in specific contexts. There's also advanced statistical modeling that can help with this, and I can talk more about this later if people want. We can think about latent class models, growth curve models, couple level models. So there are advanced statistical methods that can help us in applying these more complicated intersectional approaches to health. Okay. And last but not least, and I'll be quicker with this, is thinking about biosocial approaches. So this is one other area that I think we need to move forward in the future. Okay, so what do I mean by biosocial approaches? So by biosocial approaches, I mean understanding health as constructed simultaneously by biological and social factors. And so I should say this flows very well from the introductory comments in that it is not biological determinism, but it does take biology seriously. And so I think beautiful, true biosocial gender and health research understands biology as socially constructed and understands that biology and social environment intersect, and really in doing so does not downplay biology, but in some ways takes biology much more seriously than a biological determinist perspective. And I think that fits very nicely with what they talked about earlier in the presentations. So biosocial perspective also means thinking about sex, gender as a composite, right? So there's no pure sex effect. Do you have a pure biological effect on health? We're very hard pressed to think about a pure biological effect that is not somehow influenced by gender. And it's also important to think about this, that a biological outcome does not mean a biological cause. This is really, really important for health research, right? Because a lot of health outcomes have some sort of biological manifestation, right? That's undeniable, but that doesn't mean the cause is necessarily biological. And that's really important when we're thinking about health research and when we're thinking about gender and health research and when we're trying to think about sex and gender not as biological. So these gendered processes can become biological. And this is a core tenet of biosocial research on gender and health. And like I said, it takes the social environment and biology very seriously. So I'm going to walk through a little bit of example of how to think about a biological approach to gender and health and how to think about a social approach. And then I'm going to, if there's time, take you through a little bit about work that I'm doing currently on biosocial approaches to gender and health. Okay, so bone health. So we know of the estimated 10 million Americans with osteoporosis, about 8 million or 80% are women. Clear biological difference, right? There's clearly some biological difference going on here at the end. And just so I should say, if you don't know what osteoporosis is, you can see here a normal bone, it's very dense. An osteoporotic bone, there's a lot of holes, it's much more brittle. So an osteoporotic bone, you're much more likely to have bone breaks, you're much more likely to have fractures, etc. Okay, so this is a biological approach to bone health. And I'll make a note here that you'll notice, and this was alluded to at the beginning of the talk too, that this is in the gendered medicine, which we talked about a little bit, that kind of the concept of gendered medicine, which this is not really gender, but I put the title up there to allude to that. So there are multiple reasons for the difference in the incidence of fractures between men and women, related to the many factors associated with both bone and falls that influence fracture risk from the molecular and cellular level to the organ level. So you read here, multiple reasons, biology, right? So this is kind of the biological approach to bone health in gender and medicine. Well, there could also be a social approach, right? So what do we see here? There's two examples, right? So we see here is a woman in high heels, right? And so this shows that cultural ideas of beauty, kind of cultural ideals of what is womanhood and what is appropriate womanhood, are related to bone health problems. So high heels have been associated with joint problems, increased likelihood of falls, and increased severity of osteoporotic symptoms. Here's a social factor affecting a biological outcome. Well, what do we see here? Right, so here is a woman in a burqa, fully covered, not for lack of wanting to be outside, but what we see is that a woman here, because of gendered norms in this context, is completely covered and not able to absorb the vitamin D that is necessary for healthy bone growth. Right, so we see two examples here of gendered cultural context and how that affects bone health. This is a social way of thinking about bone health. Okay, so again, just to emphasize, a biological outcome does not mean a biological cause. So this is from the Mayo Clinic, which shows kind of an example of what your feet can actually look like and some of the damage that you can actually cause by wearing high heels that's related to osteoporosis. So again, just because you have a biological outcome does not mean there was a biological cause. And this is a core tenet of biosocial approaches. So in terms of methodology, there's a lot of great ways to do this. One of the most exciting ways that have been happening right now, I think, are critical analysis, dynamic system approaches, and a gendered embodiment model. And if Rebecca Jordan-Young doesn't talk about it tomorrow, one of my favorite of all-time pieces on this is the piece that she wrote in Social Science and Medicine on autism and thinking about, it's an amazing example of thinking about early childhood socialization, female gendered socialization as an early autism intervention, and how you can really, if you think about gender in a complex way, you can almost completely eradicate the 4-to-1 difference in autism between boys and girls. It's amazing. So I would suggest, if she doesn't talk about that tomorrow, to look at that. It's amazing. Talking too fast again, sorry. So also survey data. So there are increasingly large numbers of nationally available surveys that include biological and social data. So you have available to you looking at these data sets, and I can talk to you about what some of these data sets are that anybody can access. And then my kind of pet hobby at this point is experimental research, which is what I am moving into. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, not necessarily because it is the best way to go about it, but it's one interesting way that I think social scientists are not necessarily thinking about gender and health. And we can really use experimental work to do that. Okay, so I showed you kind of biological causes of health and social causes of health, but I didn't really show you biosocial, right? So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my work and how that is related to biosocial causes of health. So we know men die 5 years earlier than women. I showed you figures of that before. You can see that across countries. We also know that men have higher death rates for many of the aging-related causes of death, heart disease, diabetes, right? So we know these things. It was in the program. It was talked about that although there are many gender inequalities where women are generally disadvantaged, this is one place where men are often disadvantaged, right? What are some of those biosocial causes of that? Okay, so I'm going to show you this, talk a little bit about this silly, on BuzzFeed. I don't know if this is something that's just the United States, but it's there was in the newspaper a silly commentary on 25 completely scientific reasons why women live longer than men. And I'm bringing this up here because most of what the research on health and on men's health has been about is on risky behaviors and the idea that men engage in risky behaviors and that is what is harming their health and decreasing their longevity. There's absolutely evidence of that, and I'm going to show you kind of a couple silly examples of this. Okay, so the idea that this is in the newspaper and the idea that being masculine and enacting masculinity, you're likely to do things that endanger your health. So you guys see here, there's some guy propping a ladder sideways, painting, not so safe. I don't even understand what's happening here. So you have a guy clearly without a helmet, which is the least of his concerns, right? Jumping over a friend who's laying on fire. I don't know why. Right, so I put this in here in part just to break up my talking, but also to show like this is a kind of an archetypical, stereotypical example of how men enact risky behaviors in part to act masculine, right? And that these masculine behaviors affect their health. So I got my 5-minute warning. I'm going to go through this last part relatively quickly, but I don't think there's times for questions afterwards, but I'm happy to talk to people about any of this later. So one thing, though, that I've been particularly interested in is that sociologists don't pay too much attention to the middle part here. So we have masculinity, we have risk behaviors, we have not going to the doctor, we have a lot of other things happening that we pay attention to, leading to health problems. But we don't focus too much on these biological or biosocial processes. And it's colored in dark because I often talk about that and think about that as the black box, right? We say masculinity leads to poor health. I don't know biologically, it's okay, it doesn't matter. Well, I think it does matter. So I can't talk too much about this, but in some work that I'm doing with some colleagues, and you can't see it because I didn't push it, sorry. work that I'm doing with some colleagues, we've come up with a theoretical kind of conceptual paradigm to try to understand the biosocial processes that are related to the social norms and social expectations of masculinity and men's health, linking to poor health outcomes later on. So this link has been established in literature. You don't need to know all the details. I can talk about them later. This part has been established in the literature, right, so that you have increased physiological reaction to stresses. We know that that's been linked to poor health outcomes later on in life. It's been linked to the type of health outcomes that men die earlier from, the type of health outcomes that cause, in part, the lower life expectancy for men. And we know that even these reactions in a laboratory setting are associated with higher reactivity outside of a laboratory setting. Okay, so we know that you have these physiological reactions that lead to poor health. What we don't know is how does masculinity ideals cause or not cause these physiological reactions. Okay, so we know this, we don't know this. Okay, so this is what I'm trying to test in, this part here is what I'm trying to test. I have 1 minute or? Okay. This is what I'm trying to test in my research to get at the biosocial mechanisms. Okay, so very, very, very briefly, we're looking at 200 men. We actually have a little bit more than that, 18 to 25 and 45 to 65-year-olds. We give them a large number of psychosocial surveys. And then to get at masculinity threat, what we do is we have them give a speech about why they're a best candidate for their ideal job. They're in a laboratory setting. They're told to give a speech about why they're an ideal candidate for their best job. They're told they're being evaluated. There's cameras there, so they're being evaluated on a variety of things, but they're only being evaluated really on masculinity. Then they're randomly assigned, I forget I'm getting translated, they're randomly assigned to get either high or low masculinity feedback. Okay, so they give a speech about why they're a great candidate for an ideal job. They think that they're being evaluated while they're giving a speech. They're told they're being evaluated on masculinity. It's just randomly assigned. So while they're giving their speech, in the middle of giving their speech, they're going to be looking at prompts like this. And they're going to be randomly assigned to high or low masculinity, right? So you get a prompt like this. Every 20 seconds, it's going to move a little bit, right? And so you're getting this feedback randomly assigned while you're giving your speech. And this is the masculinity threat. So this is high masculinity, right? They're told they're getting high masculinity, okay? And then it looks like this at the end. Final score, masculine, 80. So the low condition, you get the points throughout it. Final score, 25, not masculine. Right, so this is the experimental paradigm. It's more complicated than that, but I have 1 minute. So, but the idea is, right, that they are told either that they're masculine or they're not masculine, randomly assigned. So we're trying to get a sense of the physiological reactions. So while we're doing this, we're measuring heart rate, blood pressure, cortisol. Okay, so very briefly, I'm going to show you we're at the very beginning, 2 slides, that's it. Yep, the very beginning of this analysis. So what this shows us, this is cortisol, which is a stress hormone. Higher levels of cortisol, more stress. And what we have here, these are people who, we broke the sample into people who strongly believe in masculinity, right? So this is a group of people who say they strongly believe in the idea that macho men should not show pain, that should be very brave. So these are the people who strongly believe in these masculinity ideals. So what we did is we have the people, masculinity threat. Those are the people who got told that they were the 25%. They were not masculine. And the masculinity confirmation, those are the people who were told they were 80%. They're very good, right? They're very masculine. They're doing well. And then we measured their cortisol. And so what you see here is that the masculinity threat group, the people who told they were low in masculinity, had a strong physiological reaction, a reaction that's predictive of poor health in the future. People who told that they were high in masculinity, they did fine. They didn't have a strong reaction. And I should say, this is not the same figure for people that did not have strong beliefs, right? So this is the figure for men who believe strongly in masculinity ideals. So what this shows us is we see an interesting intersection between ideological beliefs, so kind of these social norms, social expectations, what they're told, so kind of the social pressures and social expectations in the specific situation, and physiological reactivity that has been linked to health outcomes, right? So in some sense, this is one attempt to get at a biosocial process linking gender and health. Just again, one example. Okay, so I'm going to conclude by saying a couple things that both gender and health are really complicated. We all know this, right? So we need to move research toward thinking about and theorizing that complexity, both in gender and in health. And I hope what I've talked about today can help at least complicate the gender piece of it. And also, it's not just about the modeling, right? Framing, conceptualizing, and interpretation are key to more nuanced gender and health research. You really need to think about and interpret things in a more nuanced way. And I've talked about kind of relational, intersectional, and biosocial approaches, which I think are both great, but you'll notice that some of them don't really draw from each other. And I think a next step is to think about, for example, bringing in intersectionality into biosocial approaches, or bringing in relationality into intersectionality more, right, which we're doing. So really think about blending all of those together to create a more kind of complicated, nuanced, but realistic way of thinking about gender and health. So thank you.